Kerry O'Brien has been vocal in urging the government to update national security laws to protect journalists and whistleblowers. There seems to be recognition that media freedom is being eroded in this country, and yet we have a situation where there is an almost media blackout about Julian Assange. Although he has been held in a maximum security prison for the last 6 months with failing health, most people don't even know about it. On September 22nd, he was eligible for release, but the UK have decided to hold him in jail without charge on behalf of the US, who are trying to indict and jail him for his publishing of the Iraq and Afghan war logs. The media can no longer deny he is a political prisoner. Is the Australian media doing enough? And why is his case going mostly unreported, and what needs to happen here?
Daly, start with you.
Look, I think that it's the government should actually do something about Assange's case. He is an Australian after all. That's something that as an Australian we need to bring an Australian home.
Why do you think that's not happening?
Look, it's not happening. I think it's because of what he's done by releasing information that is top US security information, and that goes into the conversation around access of information, privacy, accessing of data, and obviously, what he did based on the US laws, security laws, really infringe upon that, and therefore I think, and it was obviously highly classified information.
But they're not locking up the New York Times publishers who put that on their front pages. They're not locking up The Guardian. They're locking up the person who got access to the information and gave it to those organisations.
But I think he managed to hack the system. He managed to send that out. And so I think that, like I said...
It's not clear yet that he hacked the system. That's not clear. That's what he's being accused of in the United States.
Yes, well, but I think that there are two issues here. One is the security information, and the other part is Julian Assange as an Australian. And we, as the government, should do what we can, and then, look at all other, issues that we can... around the whole security of information and data and privacy and all that stuff. And also for us, for Australia, we actually, my understanding is we don't have a sovereign policy around data, security of our data in Australia as well. We're the only country in the developed world that don't have that. But from my perspective, our government should do something.
OK. Jan Fran.
Oh, I think it's just been put in the too hard basket. Julian Assange is too hard for anybody to deal with because he's everything to every person. I mean, Scott Morrison's in the United States with his BFF Donald Trump at the moment. It's going to cause a bit of an incident if anything moves on this. The United States want him. Sweden, as far as I know, did want him. I think that was then rescinded and then put back. Ecuador has got a stake in this game. So does the UK. They're currently holding him. So I think Australia's just gone, and then just disappeared slowly backwards into a hedge. What
do you think about the...
And it's not good enough because, I mean, the man's been languishing in the UK, in the Ecuadorian embassy.
But let's just remember, the reason he was in the Ecuadorian embassy was because he refused to come out and respond to charges of sexual assault.
There are a number
He refused to be extradited to Sweden.
Yes, I don't think it was
Why does nobody talk about the fact that he was asked to return to Sweden to face charges of sexual assault?
I'm just going to quickly go back to our questioner, Michelle Wood. I think
he was always ready to answer the charges, the allegations. He made himself available in Sweden, was let go, he was dropped. He went to the UK. He's made himself available the entire time he was in the embassy. So that's not true. That's a lie. That's part of the smear campaign to make us forget him.
I think as well culturally, if I could just sort of make a comment on this, the sands of time appear to have shifted in quite a bizarre way around Julian Assange, and probably in through some fault perhaps of his own, maybe through no fault of his own.
So are you talking about because of his attitudes to women, or because he appeared to intervene in the US election in favour of Donald Trump.
Well, now what I'm talking about
is that why the left has, in many cases, abandoned him to his fate? You don't hear the kind of activism.
I mean, I don't think that you can say that the left has abandoned him. I think that there are still people on the left who are really fighting the fight for Julian Assange. I think when WikiLeaks first released all that information about the war crimes in Iraq, it was almost clear that what he had done was in the public interest. It did serve the public good. And then as time wore on, he was then wanted for rape charges in Sweden. So is Julian Assange, you know, a freedom fighter, or has he suddenly become a misogynist? And then we saw in 2016 the releasing of, I believe it was Hillary Clinton's email and him having some kind of a hand in the US election and Trump winning. So does that mean that Julian Assange is now fighting for the right? And it's this sort of complicated, really hard... this is what I'm saying about him being in the too hard basket, not just politically, but culturally, because we're not quite sure who Julian Assange is.
OK, Kerry O'Brien. Well, the one thing about him we know for sure is that he's been confined for a very long time, and now he's in maximum security prison, and he doesn't seem to get any help from Australia. I don't know if he ever will.
Well, he's getting
the original question was about journalism and journalists turning their back on him. The Walkleys recognised that his actions with WikiLeaks were the actions of a journalist, and he was awarded for it. And you've referred to the targeting of civilians that was so dramatically portrayed in the footage that he'd accessed and showed and distributed. The issue of Julian Assange now, you'll find that there have been. It's like a number of other issues in that go cyclically. There have been times when he's been right in the front of the news and in the headlines, and the press come out and they're in the story, and then suddenly it goes off heat for a little bit. So he's gone into jail. Very few people, I think, have been able to access him in jail. It's a question of how the story gets sustained, and I understand with a lot of stories there is a practical aspect of that. So that would be a part of it. But I do think that it is incredibly important for journalists, no matter how you might feel about, in his case, the individual, that there are principles at stake here that are incredibly important. And as a journalist, for him to be treated the way he has been, and my memory of him not wanting to go back to Sweden was because he was making the assumption that it was a ploy for the Americans to be able to extradite him.
Let's just hear from the Minister. Do you think there is a matter of principle here? Do you regard Assange as a journalist, principally? And if so, should Australia intervene in some way to help him, especially if it's likely that he's going to be extradited to face a massive trial in the United States that could see him locked away forever?
Well, I think there are 2 points. Do I regard him as a journalist? I don't. I believe he's somebody who very irresponsibly dumped a huge amount of information which undoubtedly led to lives being lost. But separately, is there something... What is the appropriate thing for Australia to do? The situation when an Australian citizen is overseas and is facing judicial processes is that we can provide consular assistance, but otherwise our citizens in other countries need to comply with the laws of those countries and go through the judicial processes of those countries. That's what is happening here, and it is, regrettably, it is... from time to time, it is the case that we have Australian citizens who are going through judicial processes in other countries. The Australian government can provide consular assistance, but we can't intervene in or override judicial processes in other countries.
And if he were to be extradited to the United States, Australia would take no action?
Well, I make the point that I've made before in terms of what we can do and what we can't do.
So how does this end, Paul? How does it end? What happens? Does he just languish in the UK forever? I can't predict the future, but he's engaged in certain actions which have the consequences of having him been involved in judicial processes. No, but I'm asking you as a representative of the Australian government who is speaking, you know, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. I mean, he's been there for almost a decade. Is he just going to die there?
It's a problem of a panel full of journalists that inevitably we're all going to be asking questions.
And there are
they have to come to an end at some point.
And there are Australian citizens who commit crimes.
Yes, and they have a trial or are either sent back. But, I mean, Julian Assange just seems to be in some limbo.
He's entitled to a presumption of innocence. He needs to go through a judicial process in the country that he's in.